The Oakwood Estates gated community was a picture of suburban perfection. Nestled on the outskirts of the city, it was a sanctuary for those who had made it, successful professionals, young families, and retirees seeking peace and quiet. Every home looked alike, with its meticulously trimmed lawns, white picket fences, and spotless driveways. On any given day, you'd find kids riding their bikes, neighbors chatting over fences, and joggers making their way down the tree-lined streets. For Alex, a 16-year-old high school junior, Oakwood Estates was both a haven and a bore. The routine of suburban life had its perks: safe streets, friendly neighbors, but it also felt suffocating. That evening, as he sat in his room listening to music, he felt a sense of unease he couldn't quite place. Maybe it was the oppressive silence, or the fact that the air felt unusually thick and humid, or perhaps it was just the monotony of life in the gated community. He shrugged it off as teenage angst, but that feeling of unease would soon become something much darker. Down the street, the Collins family was settling in for the night. Mr. Collins was flipping through the news channels, searching for something worth watching. He paused on a breaking news alert. A viral outbreak in the city was spreading rapidly. The news anchor's tone was somber as she described the symptoms: fever, aggression, and a rabid, almost animalistic behavior. But the Collins family, like many others in Oakwood Estates, dismissed the news as another far-off tragedy, a problem for the city, not for their secluded haven. At the same time, Jessica, a 17-year-old with a rebellious streak, was texting her best friend Mark. They had plans to hang out that night, sneaking out after their parents went to bed, like they had done so many times before. Unbeknownst to them, the night would take a turn that none of them could have ever predicted. It was around midnight when the first signs of trouble appeared. The streets, usually so peaceful at this hour, were disturbed by a low, persistent sound. It wasn't until the sound grew louder that people realized it was the faint wail of sirens echoing from the direction of the city. The wail was relentless, building a sense of dread that seeped into the bones of the community. Alex was the first to notice something strange on his block. As he peered out his window, he saw Mrs. Jensen, the sweet old lady who lived next door, standing in her front yard. She was usually in bed by p.m., yet there she was, swaying back and forth, staring blankly at the sky. Her dog, a tiny Yorkshire Terrier, barked frantically at her feet. Alex watched, puzzled, as she continued her strange behavior. Across the street, Mr. Collins noticed the disturbance too. Concerned, he decided to check on Mrs. Jensen. He stepped out into the cool night air and called out to her, "Mrs. Jensen, are you all right?" She didn't respond. She only turned her head slowly toward him, and when her eyes met his, he felt a jolt of fear. Her eyes were vacant, glassy, like those of a doll. Without warning, she lunged at him, her movements unnaturally quick for someone her age. Mr. Collins barely had time to react, stumbling backward and tripping over his own feet. She snapped at him, her teeth gnashing together with a sickening crunch. He scrambled to his feet and ran back to his house, slamming the door behind him. His heart raced as he locked the door and peeked out the window. Mrs. Jensen stood on his lawn, her head cocked to the side, her mouth hanging open, revealing blood-stained teeth. His wife, who had been asleep, came down the stairs in a panic, asking what had happened. But when Mr. Collins tried to explain, the words caught in his throat. What could he say? That their sweet neighbor had turned into a monster? News of the outbreak spread quickly through the community. Text messages, phone calls, and social media posts buzzed with alarming reports. More neighbors were acting strangely, with symptoms similar to Mrs. Jensen's. Some families tried to leave, but the gates of Oakwood Estates were locked tight. The security system, designed to protect them from external threats, was now trapping them inside. Jessica and Mark, who had planned to sneak out, now found themselves barricaded in their homes with their families. They exchanged frantic messages, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was it really a virus? Could it spread this fast? And how had it gotten into their community? By AM, Oakwood Estates had descended into chaos. The infected were no longer just isolated incidents. They were multiplying. Neighbors turned on each other, spreading the virus with every bite and scratch. The once peaceful community became a war zone, with screams piercing the night air and the sound of shots. The Collins family barricaded themselves in their home, but it was only a matter of time before the infected broke through. They were relentless, pounding on doors, clawing at windows, their inhuman strength fueled by the virus. Mr. Collins, armed with a kitchen knife, stood ready to defend his family, but deep down, he knew they were running out of time. Alex, watching the chaos unfold from his window, knew he had to act. His parents were out of town, leaving him alone in the house. He grabbed his baseball bat and the emergency supplies his dad kept in the garage: canned food, bottled water, a flashlight, and a first aid kit. He stuffed everything into a backpack and made a decision. He needed to find Jessica and Mark. Together, they might have a better chance of surviving the night. Alex sneaked out of his house, sticking to the shadows as he made his way to Jessica's place. The streets were eerily quiet now, but every so often, he could hear the distant moans of the infected, wandering aimlessly in search of their next victim. He kept his grip tight on the baseball bat, his heart pounding in his chest. When he reached Jessica's house, he found her and Mark in the backyard, trying to figure out their next move. Jessica was holding a metal pipe, and Mark had a crowbar. They were both visibly shaken, but their determination was clear. Together, the three of them made a plan. They would gather as many supplies as they could, then head to the community center, the largest and most secure building in Oakwood Estates. As they moved from house to house, scavenging what they could, they witnessed the full horror of the outbreak. Houses were in disarray, with signs of struggle everywhere: overturned furniture, broken windows, bloodstains. They found survivors too, but most were in a state of shock, unable to comprehend what was happening. Some begged to come with them, while others had already accepted their fate, choosing to stay behind in the ruins of their former lives. By the time they reached the community center, their group had grown to a dozen people, mostly teenagers like themselves, but also a few adults who had managed to escape the infected. They barricaded the entrances with furniture and anything else they could find, creating a makeshift fortress. Inside, the air was thick with tension and fear. As the hours dragged on, the reality of their situation began to sink in. They were trapped, with no way to contact the outside world. The power had gone out, plunging the community center into darkness. The only light came from the flickering candles they had found, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The infected were outside, pounding on the barricades, their guttural moans a constant reminder of the danger lurking just beyond the doors. Every creak and groan of the building made the survivors jump, their nerves frayed by the relentless pressure. Among the group, fear began to turn to paranoia. Some argued that they should try to make a run for it, while others insisted that they should stay put and wait for help. Tensions flared, and the group began to splinter, with small factions forming based on different survival strategies. Alex, Jessica, and Mark tried to keep the peace, but it was clear that the situation was deteriorating. The adults in the group were no longer the voices of reason. They were just as scared and confused as the teenagers. The only thing keeping them together was the knowledge that they were safer in numbers. As dawn approached, the pounding on the barricades grew more intense. The infected seemed to sense that their prey was close, and they were becoming more aggressive. The survivors knew that it was only a matter of time before the barricades gave way. In those final hours, the group made a desperate plan. If the barricades fell, they would retreat to the roof, where they could at least have a chance of escaping the infected. They gathered what weapons they had: knives, fives, and even a few makeshift Molotov cocktails, and prepared for the worst. The barricades fell just as the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon. The infected surged into the community center, their eyes wild with hunger. The survivors fought back with everything they had, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. In the chaos, the group was separated. Alex, Jessica, and Mark found themselves cornered in a hallway, the infected closing in from both sides. They fought their way to the stairs, using every ounce of strength to push back the infected. When they reached the roof, they slammed the door shut behind them and barricaded it with anything they could find. On the roof, the air was cool and crisp, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat of the battle below. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the distant sounds of the infected clawing at the barricaded door. Alex looked out over the rooftops of Oakwood Estates, once so serene and now a battlefield. The sun was rising, casting a pale light over the devastation. Smoke rose from several houses, and in the distance, they could see the infected wandering aimlessly, their numbers growing as more and more residents succumbed to the virus. Jessica and Mark joined him at the edge of the roof, their faces pale with exhaustion and fear. They knew they were trapped, with no way to escape and no help coming, but they were together, and that gave them a sliver of hope. As the infected finally broke through the door to the roof, the three friends stood side by side, ready to make their final stand. They knew their chances were slim, but they refused to give up. They would fight to the end together. And as the first rays of sunlight bathed the community in a golden glow, the battle for Oakwood Estates reached its bloody conclusion. The once idyllic gated community was now a graveyard, where the dead and the living fought a desperate war for survival. In the days that followed, Oakwood Estates became a ghost town. The virus had done its work, turning the once thriving community into a wasteland of abandoned homes and decaying bodies. The gates, once a symbol of security, now stood as a monument to the tragedy that had unfolded within. The few survivors who managed to escape told stories of the horrors they had witnessed, of neighbors turning on each other, of families torn apart, and of the relentless, inhuman hunger of the infected. But for most, Oakwood Estates was a place best forgotten. A dark chapter in the history of the virus that had spread across the country. As for Alex, Jessica, and Mark, they were never seen again. Some say they perished on that rooftop, fighting to the last breath. Others believe they somehow escaped, finding refuge in the wilderness beyond the community. But whatever their fate, their story became a legend, a tale of suburban horror that would haunt the memories of those who lived through it. And so, Oakwood Estates became a tomb, where the dead and the living coexisted in a gruesome dance of survival, trapped by the very walls that were meant to protect them. The virus had claimed another victory, and the world moved on, leaving the gated community to decay in silence, a forgotten relic of a nightmare that would never truly end.